welcome to episode 15 of the Instruction Booklet. Wow, I cracked my knuckles during that. I am your host, Jeremy, and I'm joined always by my co-host, a man who eventually will deadlift the world. That's my co-host, Michael. What's up, Michael?
Yeah, he's not lying. I mean, I would be happy if I could pull 500 pounds in a deadlift in my life.
That's like sort of like the world, right?
Yeah, it's at least part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, for those listening at home, my goal this summer was to pull a 405 pound deadlift because I started deadlifting earlier this year. It's a kind of powerlifting movement for those who aren't, I guess, weightlifting savvy. But I got inspired because I've really been interested in following like professional strongmen this year. And so I just decided to give it a go because I've been lifting for like the past 2 years or so. And just this morning, it won't be this morning anymore when you listen to this, but I was able to actually pull 415, which is actually 10 pounds higher than what my goal was this summer, which is 25 pounds higher than my previous PR, which was 390 pounds. And it's crazy because I took like 2 months off deadlifting before pulling this.
You're doing way better than me. I mean, the most for me, like I remember when I was in high school and I did track, I think I could leg press like 400 and something. But I was also like running track, and I'd been running track since like 7th grade. So I had like really strong legs, but I couldn't do any like arm stuff. So that's impressive though. That's a good number.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy about it. And now I have to just get my 225 bench and my 315 squat, and then I can retire in peace.
Walk off into the sunset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The nice thing too is that I work out in the campus gym. And so occasionally I'll be in the gym deadlifting, and one of my students will show up at the gym.
Nice.
And it's always fun because then I get to see my students like noticing me there deadlifting a ridiculous amount. Or, for them, a ridiculous amount. For professional powerlifters, 415 is nothing. But
yeah. So, okay. Well, as normal, as we start off these, Michael, what you been up to lately? What you been watching, reading? What kind of media you've been ingesting, other than lifting a lot of weights?
Yeah, since the recording of the last episode, completely watched all of the first 2 seasons of House of the Dragon.
Yeah.
Which I'm enjoying it a lot. I mean, the show's got a lot of promise. It's had some real highs, I think, especially in season 1, that have rivaled some of the best of Game of Thrones even. Naturally, along with everyone else, I'm a little bit disappointed in the season 2 finale. Sorry, listeners, if you haven't seen it yet or you're waiting to watch it, but I found it a little anticlimactic, suffice it to say, for a season finale.
Yeah, the good old hot D.
Yes.
As everybody keeps calling it.
But other than that, I mean, what is it? Been playing a lot of Hearthstone Battlegrounds. That's just kind of a easy, mindless comfort for me recently, and I've been doing really well in that. And then 2v8 and Dead by Daylight came out, which has been pretty fun. It's kind of revived my interest and a lot of people's interest in the game. It's really fun.
Yeah.
They just revealed Dracula for Dead by Daylight, which is super cool.
Yeah, from Castlevania specifically.
Yeah. And then, I was playing Mortal Kombat again with Casey a little bit just to try out Homelander.
Yeah.
He's pretty cool.
Okay. Sweet.
What about you?
I've been so in the time from the last episode to this, I did finish the Elden Ring DLC.
That's true. That happened, yeah.
And I was that last boss is
ridiculous.
Shit was hard. And that boss definitely needs an epilepsy warning.
Yeah.
And like you beat the boss and it's for the most like anticlimactic shit ever.
Yeah. The ending of the DLC was a little anticlimactic.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I still enjoyed it. I really think Shadow of the Erdtree is some of From's like best work in terms of like the like structure of like some of the level designs. Some of the dungeon designs are like really interesting. I thought some of these bosses were, even for some of the bosses that I just like handily like rolled, were some of the coolest like spectacle fights I'd seen in a while. Like,
Yep.
again, the Shadow Tree Avatar is such a cool fight, and the beast dance, the lion dancer,
Yeah. The Divine Beast Dancing Lion. That's really cool.
and fucking poor Mesmer.
Yeah.
So
Mesmer's a good fight, but
yeah. So yeah, I got to do that.
I just saw an article earlier today that somebody modded Elden Ring to take the New Game Plus cap off for. So he was able to put the game in New Game Plus 1000.
Oh God.
And he beat Mesmer without taking a single hit, and it took him 7 hours.
Jesus. God.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Just the extent that FromSoft fans will go to demonstrate just how good they are at the game is frankly appalling.
Yeah. I went and did my new game. I did a New Game Plus so I could get another achievement, and now I'm currently I'm testing out the seamless co-op mod that's got like 1 million downloads with a friend. So that's going to be kind of fun. Looking forward to that. Playing some Balatro because that's like my comfort game right now too. Like I can always just boot it up and just kind of like mash my face against it for a little bit. I bought Dave the Diver for my Switch, and I've been playing that, and that game is like hella addictive.
Yeah, the gameplay loop is so good.
It just when you think you're done with like gameplay things, it just adds another thing.
Yeah. In the 11th hour, it still keeps introducing new gameplay mechanics, and it's really amazing.
Yeah, I even got our editor on it. He's been playing the hell out of it, so I'm sure he will appreciate that. And I've been reading. Just my Saga came back. So
really?
Yeah,
I gotta catch up.
The first issue of the new arc is out.
I'll wait for the volume.
Yeah, I'll read it in singulars. And I've been reading a couple other things. I've been reading Demons of the Shadowlands, which has been pretty awesome. The creator of Full Metal Alchemist started a new series.
Oh, interesting.
And it's been really good. I'm definitely enjoying it. I watched all of The Boys in those time frame. I managed to watch all of The Boys and all of like season 2 of Invincible. So
nice. Both very good.
Yeah, I managed to like plow through those. We're almost done with the 3rd season of The Bear, which is, like the first 3 episodes were like super stressful, but everything beyond that point has been really good.
There's some really good episodes later in the season.
Yeah, I agree. So I got 1 episode left, and other than that, I've just been watching the Olympics. Track and field's been my jam. So. Yeah, it's been nice. And I went and saw Deadpool and Wolverine, so
very cool.
It's a good movie. I enjoyed it a lot. The writing is still just like top tier, so
yeah.
So yeah. But anyway, so I guess onto our episode. So this episode's going to be another history episode, and we are still currently in the nebulous period of like the middle of the 1980s because where we left off last time, we talked about the video game crash and everything that happened. And we gave y'all a heads up warning that we were going to be sitting on the crash for a few minutes because there is some other important stuff that we feel like we need to talk about in the run up to getting out of the crash. And today's kind of been it's been a fun research project on the far side. We're talking about Japanese game industry from the middle of the 1970s up to the 1980s because Japan really, I think in terms of from like a technological standpoint, were sort of a little bit behind in terms of video games when they start coming out. And as this episode's you'll kind of see where they caught up to us. They caught up to the West and to the US and Europe, and then kind of like blew past. And how they kind of like set the tone for maybe I'd say even the next 15 years to come. So it's kind of neat. I think, we were looking at the notes the other night and just all the formulations and like this was done first in Japan kind of came between our conversations. So
yeah, it is interesting how Japan interestingly seems to be at the beginning of the gaming industry, and I guess we'll get into this more specifically, but there's many things in which they just happen to be the pioneers of, like light gun technology and controllers and stuff like that. But how they're kind of so content to just play on the back foot for much of the 70s. Like, so much of their game design seems to just be oriented around copying what Western game studios are doing, until it is.
Yeah. They were just right place, right time.
Yeah.
So the first little bit I have here is from a article called "The Foundation of Geemu: A Brief History of Early Japanese Video Games" by Martin Picard, and he defines Geemu as the term meaning like games that are very Japanese. I don't know if it's like an official term or if it's like something that he like formulated. So it's but he states here that if, as stated by Klein et al., the invention of the video game could not have taken place without foundational developments in the computer industry and a university research institute, all subsidized by the military space complex. This is from another article from 2003. The emergence of the video game industry in Japan has developed in a different context. The Japanese video game industry is one of those industries in Japan that was imported from the United States during the 20th century, but that was able to somehow improve the model. The formation of Japanese video game industry is strongly tied to the specific socio-economic situation of Japan after World War II. Some major industrial sectors took part in the birth of the game industry, from amusements to consumer electronic industries to toy and television manufacturers. Japanese video game industry was not supported by the military academic complex or even initiated by startups, but rather developed from the outset by entertainment corporations and import-export businesses that were already well established in the consumptive post-war Japan. So, like, this kind of talks about, like, we kind of talked about this a bit when we were starting the series off, where it's like video games started off in like as like research projects, and like they spawned out of things like, I don't know, somebody taking a radar telescope and like making two little dots bounce around and, bouncing things back and forth. So, or like there's a lot of war games and stuff, as to where Japan took it more from an amusement and entertainment prospect, which definitely kind of changes how you look at games in that sense. So I think like you brought it up the other day when we were talking about how, like, you see a lot of Western games were more focused on like military strategy and stuff.
Yeah. My hypothesis would be that is a difference in game design that has lingered even into the present. Mm-hmm. Because, and I'm picking specific examples here that I guess favor this theory. But when I was growing up, like the late 2000s, early 2010s, mm-hmm. the kind of games that were extremely popular, the AAA titles in the US, I remember games like Call of Duty, Gears of War, Halo, Medal of Honor. I mean, it was a lot of war games specifically. Mm-hmm. And I think that is reflected in the history of the medium as far as like early Western games, games like Space War, right? One of the first, commonly pointed to as one of the first video games, even though we complicated that a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a war game. And, that's not to say that early Japanese game developers were not also making war games, but, the fact that it was based on entertainment rather than perhaps simulation or sought after for some other utilitarian purpose like training. That's why the Japanese game industry is responsible for things like Mario and Sonic. In Japan, they like their goofy little guys, and in the United States of America, we like, I don't know, badass soldiers or something.
Yeah, the gruff stuff,
Right.
Yeah, I think even here, like, I think I had another quote from a different article called "Taking a Closer Look at Video Game History in Japan" from April 18th. Since Japan as a nation has massively embraced video games ever since the first video game, Space War, which we'll asterisk that, was created in the United States in 1962. In addition to the likes of Sonic and Mario becoming cult of video game characters, many of the most well-known game consoles, such as the Game Boy and the Sega Mega Drive, came out of Japan. In fact, a video game industry expert, Blake J. Harris, told CNN, "Without the contributions of Japan, we wouldn't have a video game industry." The first video games to come to Japan were arcade games in the form of Astro Race, which was released in 1973, and then Space Invaders in 1978. Space Invaders became the first successful game and was then followed by Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. So, even there, like, it's like, they got Space Wars here, but Japan really doesn't start seeing anything until a little bit later. And even to follow that up with stuff from the foundation of Geemu is in Japan, the advent of arcade games could not have happened without prior development of the amusement business. Roots go so far as the Corinthian games introduced during the Taisho era at Japanese festivals, exhibitions, and other outdoor venues, and later with department store rooftops and pachinko parlors, which I have to come back to pachinko in a minute because of some funny stuff. Nearly a year after the commercialization of one of the first video games in the United States, with Pong in 1972, Japanese amusement machine companies became quickly involved in the burgeoning industry. Two companies in particular, Taito and Sega, created Pong clones and distributed them to the amusement parks. Thanks to overseas relationships, Japanese companies already knew very well what was happening in the U.S. market and were fast to react accordingly. Taito, founded in 1953 by a Russian businessman who specialized at the time in importing vending machines, released Elipong in 1973. In the same month, Sega, a merging of Rosen Entertainment and Service Games, founded by two Americans, but settled in Japan after World War II to import U.S. amusement machines, especially for American military bases established in Japan, also released a Pong clone called Pongtron, followed a few months later by Pongtron 2 and Hockey TV. You have these there's they were hearing about Pong, and then suddenly these machines start popping up. And it's funny to me about the pachinko machine thing because I was listening to a podcast today where they were talking about Japan developers and how you don't get fired often there. Like, they have to make really good reasons to why to cut people. And instead, they'll just send their developers to pachinko hell, because Konami has Castlevania pachinko machines or Silent Hill pachinko machines. And then I started thinking about the funny part of Guilty Gear has a pachinko machine that is plot relevant.
Really?
Yes. Arxis has a Guilty Gear pachinko machine that has plot relevant material in it.
That's bizarre.
It sounds like Arxis to me. So anyway, you had all these fun amusement things that were kind of created early on in Japan through festivals. And then, in the post-World War II time, which I'm not a history person very well, and, Japan's industry in terms of building electronics, they were building stuff, sending them to the US so they could build these machines. So that's where Japan was kind of watching stuff happening but never really capitalized on it until suddenly Pong, and then they were we can do that. I guess Japan kind of contributed to the Pong clone crisis. So
yeah, they were more than happy.
Yeah, clones. And then Taito was the ones who made Space Invaders, and right. Space Invaders blew up. So yeah, it's almost as Japan sort of had their foot in the door prior to the crash, but just wasn't fully had fully stepped in yet.
Right. It's probably a good place to be, before a major industry crash.
Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing. I never really found anything when I was looking through stuff. Is the crash of '78 really didn't affect them.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see any mention of it. I mean, I know you mentioned briefly when we were talking about the notes that the Japanese game industry is perhaps not as well documented.
Yeah, it's not. There's a book that I found. Oh, there were 3 books written by this guy who was like going, and he spent like 5 years in Japan just interviewing developers. And it was almost like a personal project. And he was supposed to do a 4th volume, but I think he just like ran out of money. But he even brought up how, like, you know, they don't talk a whole lot about the early days of the game industry just because a lot of them are not around anymore, or it's just something they just don't talk about. And the West doesn't have very great documentation, and Japan really wasn't really documenting it at the time. It's almost kind of like how we were talking about with game preservation, how, like, you know, stuff just gets lost. Like, there's probably so many games that were developed in Japan that we may never have even heard of that were just lost to time.
Well, that goes back to, you know, one of the very first things I think we talked about on the podcast is that even in the West, a lot of early game history is kind of difficult to catalog because, save for the few efforts of people who were actively attempting to do it at the time, you know, a lot of it's dead media or lost media, such that it's very difficult to go back and get access to, you know, the games that were coming out at the time.
Right.
And in all of the research that I've had to do for the, you know, history of the early games industry, you know, Japan is conspicuously absent, despite how central they are to, I guess, the history of the gaming industry in general.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. And you know, there's also probably, like, there's some cultural stuff there where, like, you know, with gaps, just not to mention, like, I don't know. And this is like, I guess it would be like in speculative, like, territory where it's like, you think about how, like, in the West, we probably, like, documented things, like, very rigorously. And if the game industry started with academia / military, they're going to document it way more thoroughly than, like, with Japan. If they're focusing more on entertainment and amusement, you probably wouldn't think that it would make that mental association. It's like, oh, this is just something for fun.
Right.
I mean, I could be wrong. You know, again, this is a very weird area, and researching it was difficult at times. Like, originally this episode was supposed to be just about Japanese game development, but the more I just got to looking into it, the more I found out that it was much harder. And then it's like, it changed focus into, well, what about just talking about Japanese game industry as a whole in this early time period? Because it almost seems like it's very nebulous. It's an area that we like, as a gaming industry, like, with, like, historians and stuff like that, they don't know a whole lot about.
Right.
So,
I think, I know, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying, like, so it's just kind of interesting that, like, I think it's helpful that we're discussing this topic as a whole.
Yeah.
So
I think in the brief research that I was doing looking into this, it was mentioned, this might just come from actually the Wikipedia for the early Japanese game industry, but as far as the influences for early Japanese game design were concerned, there are some major differences. I mean, like, you know, one that's near and dear to my heart being Dungeons and Dragons.
right.
The first Japanese translated version of D&D was actually not around until 1985.
Interesting.
And so there's a weird kind of, like, one step removed degree of influence between D&D and, like, many of the early Japanese, like, RPGs, like fantasy games.
Right.
Because while Western game developers, you know, are making games like D&D and Petit 5 and Moria.
Yeah.
There's a direct line of influence between the tabletop Dungeons and Dragons and those games. But the games that predate 1985 in Japan that are like fantasy RPGs are actually more so just influenced by the Western RPGs and perhaps other fantasy media than they are directly influenced by D&D. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how these kind of staggered historical developments do create a perhaps like a possibility space for differences to emerge.
Yeah, that can make sense.
And that's why perhaps Japanese fantasy RPGs aesthetically, I think, have always been a little bit different. Like JRPGs have there's a certain X factor. Like you can look at them and you can kind of tell.
Yeah, you know that you're looking at a JRPG.
Right. The Witcher is very different from Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like an interesting, like, that's something I had to think about, was like, as to where the West was more influenced by like materials. Like you think about like Lord of the Rings coming out, even to like a certain degree, like Star Wars and Star Trek.
Right.
So, I mean, granted, Star Wars made it to Japan as well. It wound up being like a pretty big hit there, but like it must have been at a little bit of a later date.
Yeah. So. It would be interesting to perhaps hear from like a Japanese media historian, what kind of prominent, like, what was popular in Japan as far as the 1970s and the 1980s were concerned culturally, and certainly those would have been affecting.
Yeah, because I mean, they have their own culture and their own stories that they could pull from as well.
Right.
So here's like a fun little blip that I found as well to talking about like the video game crashes. This came from the Video Games in Japan wiki. The North American video game industry was devastated by the 1983 video game crash, but in Japan it was more of a surprise to developers, and it was typically known in Japan as the Atari shock. After the video games crash, analysis doubted the long-term viability of the video game industry. So it's interesting that, like, this is where we kind of talked about how, like, the video game crash is more like in a bottle with, like, America as a whole and a little bit of Europe. But, like, Japan was just kind of like, oh, well, that happened. Just keep going. Yeah, it didn't really hit them as hard.
Yeah.
Because, I don't think they had near as, like, the bad investments that were going on in America, throwing anything in the wall to see if it sticks, over promising and stuff like that. Their arcade culture very much was large, and even to this day, Japanese arcade culture is still thriving.
Yeah.
So I'm very jealous that their arcades have seats.
Yeah. That does seem nice.
Yeah.
I mean, I think based on what we know of the crashes that happened in the US, this is, I mean, not to say that the arcades survived, because notoriously they didn't. But everything that I've read seems to suggest that, the problem may have just been the oversaturation of the home game market.
Right.
So it could be an interesting difference as far as like why, for instance, Japan didn't suffer as much as the US, is perhaps that, there was still more cultural capital in arcades at that time than there was a desire to have a machine at home that could play video games.
I also imagine to the point that, like, they probably still suffered a little bit, because you have to think, like, some of the microchips and the processing stuff was being built in Japan, and they were exporting it, so they might have seen a degree of, like, some profit loss there, but theirs probably wasn't nowhere near as bad as, like, with like Atari promising way more systems than they actually had. So like, to move it on just a little bit, so now that we've kind of just like talked about like how games, kind of brief summary of like how games kind of started, and like a little brief talking about like what was going on during the crash, like kind of want to talk about now is like how the game philosophy in the 80s and 80s would go on to influence a lot to come. And I have a quote here from an article called History of Japanese Video Games by John That is a really difficult last name to pronounce. It's like Szczepaniak or something. It's very European. I'll have the links posted so you'll be able to see this. But it says here that Japanese games have a very uniqueness to them, which, to a point what you said earlier, in much the same way that American, British, and French games all once had distinctive qualities, though nowadays they tend to be more homogenized. Games may have started in America, but Japan very quickly saw the technology, assimilated it, made some adaptations, and began producing something divergent. Games such as Wizardry and Ultima started in the West, captivated Japanese audiences, who then went on to produce an eclectic array of strange RPGs for computers. Before you had Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy cementing the genre tropes, which eventually evolved into RPGs such as Suikoden, mentioned earlier. This dark age of JRPGs prior to Dragon Quest is almost like a Cambrian explosion with strange and exotic experiments. For example, Panorama Toe was released in 1983 and is one of the first games from the creator of Legacy of Wizard on the NES, Yoshikiya. It's a weird game. There's a 3D first-person dungeon in ASCII, a hexagonal grid overworld. You fight tanks and lions and even visit a pornography store. It was also all programmed in BASIC, and there are no rules, just fresh creativity. That is... I kind of want to find this game now.
Yeah, it sounds wild.
Because of a 3D first-person dungeon built in ASCII.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, are there images that we could find?
I bet there are. Let's
Because that I'm just curious. I just need to know.
Oh man. Oh wow. Yep, I already found. I'm gonna send this to you right now so you can see this. I just want you to see this box art.
This is an untapped market. Oh yeah, that's some very interesting box art.
Yeah, that is some box art right there. So yeah. It looks like it even has maps that look kind of like Rogue.
Yeah, it definitely is giving Rogue. And some of the visuals.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I like how there's like this box art that's like really detailed drawn like fantasy, and then you scroll down and the next scene is just like 8-bit image of sort of the box art.
Yeah, the ASCII 3D visuals are very interesting.
Yeah, so
yeah, for those following along at home, you can link in the description.
Yeah, I will definitely link this in the notes for people to go check out. And when you get to this part, just pause the episode, go look this up, and then just follow along with us as we're staring at this page, like bizarre, looking at this like glimpse into the past.
Yeah.
So some of these sprite designs for these characters are incredibly weird.
Yeah. I know you briefly mentioned when we were talking about the notes that there was some discussion of the displays in Japan having higher fidelity on average.
Yeah. So when the games industry kind of like began in Japan, and this will kind of like help us. We'll our next history episode will kind of talk more about like computers, because the home computer market was a very big deal during this time period. And in fact, there's a quote from this history of Japanese video games article that I have, where it was it's taking a picture of two developers, and it said, of course, as the 1980s rolled on and as the Famicom ended up in so many homes, there were indeed a shift out to consoles. To give an example, the photo above shows Toki Naito on the left, creator of the action RPG Heidelin, an extremely important release in Japan circa 1984. I know the NES port has an unpopular reputation outside of Japan, but you need to understand the context. It is one of the earliest action RPGs ever developed, preceded by Courageous Perseus and perhaps a few other action RPGs all on computer. It is also the earliest documented example of a recharging health bar, predating Falcom's Wise by a few years and Halo's Shields by a decade. When I interviewed Naito, he explained that the later Famicom conversion sold 1 million copies. When adding together all the computer versions, the total sales for only just matched it by another 1 million. So that's 1 million sales divided between the PC-88, the PC-98, the PC-66, Sharp's X1, Fujitsu's FM7, the MXX1, the MXX2, and finally the MZ2000. So Japan kind of like got hit with the computer development like bug, and just like in terms of like excitement long before as I guess almost not even long before, like as like the same time as the US and Europe was. But because of how the technology was working over there, their computer displays were actually better than ours. And it actually wound up like to their advantage. It allowed them to create more detailed screens, allowed them to like work more. But unfortunately, a lot of it kind of gets like left down to the side whenever the Famicom comes around.
Right.
So, because the Famicom just kind of like upends everything. There's another quote that I had from another area. So I can find it real quick, where it talked about this with the people like developing games on computers and how the computer explosion just kind of like really kind of set things in motion. So here we go from the earlier article that I talked about, the foundation of Geemu. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. There's a part where it says the foundation of a major electronic gametainment industry, as well as the export of Japanese video games in the U.S. territory, was not done uniquely in home consoles and arcade sectors, but also in the home computer market. Shortly after the first successful microcomputers and personal computers in the West, being the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the TRS-80 in 1977, Japanese electronic companies such as Canon, Hitachi, Matsuyushi, Mitsubishi, and Sony were also keen to start their own market on their territory, especially since a good portion of the parts were used in personal computers at the time were manufactured in Japan. Following the US, they developed an R&D program powerful enough to be self-sufficient in their territory. They developed several computers designed solely for the Japanese market, using microcomputer boom at the end of the 1970s with models such as the Soford M200 smart home computer series announced in September of 77, and the more successful semi-kit Sharp MZ80K put the market in December of 78. So you had this like situation where, Japan's making all of these like computer parts for the US, and then they're going, well, hey, these are selling really well. We have the technology here. Why don't we just make our own?
Yeah.
So
that is interesting.
And then
one thing.
Oh, go ahead.
One thing. Yeah, I'm kind of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole myself here, but and I do think maybe you mentioned this, but it seems that one of the major contributions of the Japanese game industry, like especially towards the late 70s and the early 80s, was they seem to have pioneered handheld gaming a lot more than the West, at least as far as like actual video games on a handheld.
Yeah, because you had like the Game & Watch.
Yeah, the Game & Watch in the early 80s, I think in 1980 actually exactly, was Nintendo began to release a series of electronic games designed by Yokoi called the Game & Watch games. Mm-hmm. But even kind of... What is it? Oh yeah, so apparently the inspiration for the Game and Watch comes from so the creator Gunpei Yokoi in 1979, and this comes from Wikipedia, which I can send you the link for. This is just the handheld electronic games Wikipedia, but he saw a bored businessman playing with an LCD calculator by pressing the buttons. And so he had the idea for a watch that doubled as a miniature game machine for killing time, which he wanted to call the Game Watch, which is hence where game and watch comes from.
Right.
And, you know, they kind of, this industry really also kind of benefited from the fact that, you know, Japan had LCD screens that were inexpensive and could be produced quite easily.
Yeah. Plus, they're not having to pay like an import cost.
Yeah. So, additionally, in addition to the Game and Watch, apparently there was a variant of Pac-Man that was made by a Japanese toy company called Tomy. In 1981, a handheld of Puck-Man, as we know, the original Japanese name.
Right.
There were some solar-powered handheld devices. The Bandai LCD Solar Power in 1982 was the first solar-powered gaming device, and probably one of the only solar-powered gaming devices.
Yeah.
However, you know, there is that weird Hideo Kojima Game Boy Advance game.
Oh man, yeah, the one that uses the sun, right?
Yeah. Actually, it might be a regular Game Boy game. I'm not sure if it was Game Boy Advance, but I don't know if that counts as a solar-powered game so much as a game that uses solar energy as a mechanic.
Yeah.
But it is kind of interesting that once again we see an example here of how Japan at the beginning was one of the pioneers of handheld gaming, and I think to this day they kind of remain they're kind of uncontested.
Yeah.
In the handheld gaming space. I mean, there wasn't so, you know, Sony made an attempt, and I guess Sony's a Japanese company too, but you know, the PS Vita didn't really do that well. It's kind of just Nintendo. You know, they had the Game Boy Advance, which did really well, and then the DS, which was popular for many years, and now the Nintendo Switch.
Yeah, it's like bridged the gap.
Yeah, it's bridged this interesting gap of being both a home console and a handheld.
Yeah.
Which the Steam Deck, I guess, also is kind of in that space now, though. You know, I don't know as many people with Steam Decks as I know people with Nintendo Switches.
Right. And, you know, and that's kind of like there's other people who are trying to enter that market now because they saw the success of the Switch.
Right.
Yeah, so it's almost like it's really interesting because like Japan had all of this stuff that was like working for them in the late 70s, and then when the home gaming market just kind of bottoms out in the US, Japan just is able to keep going because they don't suffer the same lack of faith almost, you know.
Right.
And they're able to like step in, kind of take over, and from there they're able to like push their design philosophies through games as Western developers start seeing as all of like these Nintendo games, you know, start coming out. Even to the, like, you know, because like the first few years of the Nintendo, like the home entertainment, like the NES was out, people, you know, Nintendo was very strict about who could make games about stuff.
Right.
And then they finally opened up to third-party developers, and then, you know, Sega jumps in. And so, you know, this is stuff that we're eventually going to cover, but it's like you kind of see where the dominoes start to, like, you know, are being set up, and then they just kind of fall down in the favor of all of these Japanese, like, developers. I have another quote here talking about, like, with the computer, like the home computers going on, that I think is kind of interesting, where it says, you know, since Japan was already booming in the development of the arcade video games at the turn of the 1980s, and as home computers elsewhere were becoming especially dedicated to playing video games since their graphics and sounds were more advanced, video games also became in Japan in the main software associated with personal computers. Which, here's a list of all of these personal computers that existed in Japan, which was like the PC 8001, the PC 8801, the PC 9801, Sharp's X1, the X68000, the Fujisaki FM7, the FM Towns, the Tommy Puya, and the Toshiba MSX. The success of all of these and the standards brought many Japanese video game developers to produce exclusive titles for these platforms, series such as Dragon Slayer, Threnix, Ys, Metal Gear, Snatcher, RPG Suron, which was called RPG Maker, made their debut on this platform, and then this allowed companies such as ASCII, HAL Laboratories, Neon Falcom, Microcabin, Enix, and Square all began their video game production in the personal computer software industry. And for those that know, Metal Gear and Snatcher were some of Kojima's first games. So, but all of their computer software stuff kind of gets derailed when the Famicom becomes the main thing. But what's even more interesting is there was like a group of people in Japan who were like quietly getting PC games from the US imported into Japan so they could play them, and then they were exporting games that they were making to the West. So it's an interesting little thing to like think about, as in when we get into the next history episode where we talk about like how like PC game development was going on.
Right.
So
it is funny. I did a couple of years ago get into one of those games you mentioned, Ys or Ys.
It starts with it's like a Y with like a little S.
YS.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've never known exactly how it was pronounced, but I don't know, just random comment that I had. It's a fun game.
Yeah,
it doesn't work as well on PC as it did on the original console, I suppose. But
and that's like. I've watched plenty of people like playing Snatcher, and it's like, folks talking about how like Kojima had all these lofty ideas and stuff like that, and the game's like really interesting to watch, but like definitely it's one of those instances where Kojima needed someone behind him to really rein in some of those ideas.
Yeah. I don't know. Personally, I think Kojima's at his best whenever he gets to do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Let him do the most batshit insane thing he can think.
Right. One last little blurb I have here, and this is, I think, from the Wikipedia, is the Wizardry series became popular and influential in Japan, even more so at home. Japanese developers created the action RPG subgenre in the early 1980s, combining RPG elements with the action arcade style and action adventure elements. The trend combining role-playing elements with arcade-style action mechanics was popularized by a game called The Tower of Drugan, an arcade game released by Namco in 1984. While the RPG elements in Drugan were very subtle, its success in Japan inspired the near simultaneous development of 3 early action role-playing games. Combining Drugan's real-time hack-and-slash gameplay with stronger RPG elements, all released in 1984, were Dragon Slayer, Courageous Perseus, which we mentioned earlier, and Heidelin. So it's kind of neat thinking about it in the sense that like the development cycle is just like a big circle. Like the West makes a game, Japan looks at it and goes, wow, that's really awesome. I bet we could do this and make it better. And then they release something over to the West, and eventually that would turn into the West going, wow, those are really neat elements. We should try these out.
Yep. A good give and take, I guess. Yeah. There's competition.
It makes me kind of think about like how you were like mentioning earlier, talking about like, Japan has like games have like a particular flavor to them and stuff like that. It makes me think about how Japan perceives fantasy versus how we perceive fantasy. Like in the US, you think about fantasy and your brain's like, oh, like, it's more like European based.
Right. Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm. But then you look at Japan's like take on fantasy, and it's like Berserk and like Dragon Quest and even think about like Dark Souls and stuff like that. It's like a dark fantasy, but it's like taking all of these like bizarre elements. So
Right.
and then that stuff gets ported over here, and then we see it, and we're like, oh, this is really neat and interesting. And so then we start like adapting those elements into our stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting little cycle. So yeah. So that kind of, I think, in a very brief and broad fashion, this is kind of the story of like with how Japan kind of like comes up, takes in, and is going to dominate things moving forward, at least for a while. I think we said this yesterday in the notes, where it's like, Japan kind of like maintains this like big grip on like the video game industry on the home console side, probably until the Xbox shows up.
Yeah.
I think it was
right. I keep reminding myself. I have to remind myself that PlayStation is also a Japanese console.
Right.
For some reason, in my brain desperately wants to think it's not, but it is.
Yeah. I think it was you that was like saying, you're like, who knew that the Xbox was going to be such a significant thing? But it's kind of like a nice little turning point for like an American company entering the game console market.
Right. Microsoft, as you were saying, kind of had, it was already well established as just being a good, trustworthy figure in the space of, I guess there's home electronics.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they had a lot of money, obviously, right? So they were in a position, I guess, where they could just venture into the space pretty confidently.
Yeah.
But it's funny because in the history of the gaming industry, the Xbox shows up kind of late. I mean, we've barely even gotten into the 80s substantially, and Xbox doesn't even show up until the 2000s.
Yeah. We haven't even like begun to talk about console wars yet.
Right.
So.
And yet somehow for the past 2 or so decades, the gaming industry has been held in a vice grip of just like 3 major companies that make consoles.
Right. So, all right. I think that kind of roughly wraps things up. I guess, any final thoughts you have exiting this, Michael, that you may have not had prior to coming into it?
I'm trying to think if I do. I'm not sure I do.
Okay.
I think you were definitely did the major share of the research for this episode. So I was kind of interested to just hear exactly what you had been able to dig up.
All right. Okay. Well, so our next episode is going to be kind of fun. It'll be our off-month episode, as we're going to have our first guest, a friend of ours that we have picked on a few times in the show.
Picking on Pickens.
Yeah, picking on Pickens, our friend Adam. But we're going to be talking about, I think you're kind of excited about this subject as well, is we're going to be talking about the history of narrative in games. So
yes.
I think that should be a fun topic as we like kind of map how games started working narrative into their stuff, even to like the point where nowadays you have games that are just entirely narrative and barely any game function.
Yes, walking simulators, as they're so infamously derided sometimes.
So yeah, so that this should be a fun episode. I look forward to hearing what you and Adam both have to say about these things.
Oh, I'm sure it will be thoroughly entertaining having Adam on the podcast.
Yeah. So yeah, that'll be that, and then our next month will be then the one after that will be so that episode 18 will be a history episode where we're going to talk about gaming on home PC consoles, which is going to put the gun to my head and force me to read Masters of Doom.
Very good,
because I feel like that's going to be important. Then we'll have our October episode, which we'll do something spooky. I don't know. Maybe we'll give Resident Evil a fair shake. maybe.
When does the Silent Hill remake come out?
I was about to say, or we might just talk about Silent Hill. Let's see. Let me look it up real quick.
Silent Hill is a game franchise that I'm convinced that I would love if I actually played it. And, disclaimer, I haven't. So,
well, Silent Hill 2 remake comes out October 8th, 2024. Might be time for us to stream some Silent Hill. Who knows? We're kind of making that one up. November will be our last history episode of the year as we discuss this small upstart company from Japan named Nintendo. I hear they're a big deal. I don't know. December will be our obligatory award show. We'll have some fun. We'll talk about stuff we've played this year. We'll talk about some topics that we're really chomping at the bit to talk about, because there's been some shit that's gone down this year in gaming.
Yes.
And we're gonna save that one for the end of the year.
Yeah. Our Dr. Disrespect episode.
Yeah, we're gonna do our entire episode about Moog, the Lord of Blood.
Yeah.
And how he wasn't really a bad guy.
How Moog beat the allegations, even if Dr. Disrespect couldn't.
The beating the allegations Moog memes have been the best thing to come out of the Elden Ring DLC.
I agree.
So, and then that'll be the end of the year. And then the next year will be rolling on. We'll still be mucking around in the 80s, and at some point we'll bust up into the 90s, and things are gonna get real interesting when we get there.
Yes.
So,
the 90s are great.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're in the 80s right now. That was my time of year when I was born, but I didn't really start playing games until maybe the early 90s. So, all right, we'll do our plugs and then we'll wrap things up. And yeah, so Michael, where can the folks find you these days?
My Instagram, macroll_prawns. I keep bumping into my mic. Also, if you want to see my 415 deadlift, that's it's on the Instagram. So
yeah.
Other than that, I have a more limited social media presence, I guess, because I don't use X or Threads or whatever app people are on these days. I mean, I guess I'm on Facebook, but it's just a private Facebook account. So
who uses Facebook for anything?
Yeah, I know. Crazy.
Yeah.
What am I, a boomer?
Yeah. So you can find me on twitch.tv/backward tarot. I'm also on Instagram and I have Facebook for my art for Press Art F4. We have Cajun Greatness. I think our Belafonte Travolta movie just came out, and it was something. Man, that movie was bad. Yeah, it was real bad. I'll have to tell you about it afterwards. The show itself, the Instruction Booklet, we have a link tree. It's linktr.ee/Instruction Booklet. You'll find all of our links. We also have a Twitch for twitch.tv/The Instruction Booklet. I got a capture card, so I'll actually be able to stream old Nintendo games soon.
Ooh, very cool.
We'll be able to use our Switches and do some 2-player stuff, hopefully.
Yeah.
And who knows? Maybe in the next month or so, the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 Marvel vs. Capcom collection, we can just stream us trying to beat the hell out of each other in Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Yeah, I'm so excited to play some MVC2.
Yeah, or some X-Men Children of Adam.
Yeah.
But yeah, and also we're generally here on the AOSCH network. We thank them for putting up with our bullshit. So they have a YouTube channel where they upload these episodes on. They upload our episodes on their SoundCloud as well as Spotify, which is generally where I post our episode links. So yeah. So thanks for tuning in. Tune in again next episode as we drag our friend Kicking and Screaming onto this show to talk about narrative and games. So,
yes.
Until next time, we'll talk to y'all later.
Yep.
So see y'all.
See you.